Judge Robert Collins sat at the bench, his gaze fixed on the papers in front of him. He was known for his no-nonsense demeanor and swift decision-making. In his courtroom, he commanded respect with his calm but firm voice. Today, however, a new case had caught his attention, one that felt unusually charged. Amara James stood confidently before him, a black woman in her early 30s, dressed in a sharp black suit that contrasted against her determined expression. She had a reputation as a force in both legal and media circles, though she was relatively unknown to the average citizen. Her presence in the courtroom, however, was not typical. She was being accused of violating a newly enacted local media regulation designed to limit what was deemed unregulated content on social media platforms, particularly political messages that did not meet specific editorial guidelines. The regulation was controversial, criticized by many as a thinly veiled attempt to suppress certain political voices, particularly those from marginalized communities. Amara had been vocal in her opposition to the law, which she argued disproportionately targeted people of color and independent voices. She had even taken to social media to rally her supporters and organize protests against the policy, igniting a firestorm of online debate. Judge Collins reviewed the case details. Amara had posted several video commentaries on her social media accounts, some of which included sharp critiques of the local government's handling of media freedom. According to the law, these videos violated the requirement that any political content be properly verified and adhere to the state's guidelines for balanced and fair reporting. "You are fully aware of the new law, Ms. James," Judge Collins said, his tone clinical. "This is not a case of freedom of speech, but rather a matter of compliance with the regulations. The penalties for this violation are clear." Amara did not flinch. "Your Honor, with all due respect, this law is a direct attack on free speech. It targets voices like mine, voices of people who challenge the status quo. You're not just fining me for my words. You're fining me for standing up for justice." The courtroom fell into a heavy silence as the judge regarded her with a look of professional detachment. He was unmoved, and yet something about her words lingered. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation, and Amara's defiance seemed to stir something in the air. The judge tapped his gavel lightly, the sound sharp against the tense atmosphere. "Given the evidence, I am left with no choice," Judge Collins said. "A fine of $5,000 will be imposed for this violation." Court adjourned. As Amara's lawyer, visibly frustrated, argued with the judge's ruling, Amara herself stood motionless. The fine would be a heavy blow, but she already knew it was only the beginning. What she didn't know, however, was that this courtroom encounter, this fine, was about to make her name one that would be spoken across the country. And the judge, in issuing that penalty, had unknowingly set in motion a fight that would force him to confront everything he thought he knew about justice. Amara James had never been one to back down from a fight. Born and raised in a modest neighborhood in the heart of the city, she had grown up understanding the weight of words and their power to both uplift and dismantle. Her parents, both educators, had instilled in her the belief that knowledge could be a tool for change, but it was her ability to speak truth to power that made her a force to be reckoned with. She excelled academically, eventually earning a scholarship to a prestigious law school where she became an outspoken advocate for civil rights and media reform. By the time she graduated, she had already gained a reputation as a rising star, someone who could navigate both the intricacies of the law and the broader, often messy world of public discourse. But it was her work in media advocacy that truly set her apart. Amara recognized early on the influence the media wielded over society and how marginalized voices were often silenced or misrepresented. She made it her mission to challenge the status quo. Amara's first major project after law school involved working with grassroots organizations to challenge corporate media monopolies that disproportionately limited access to diverse viewpoints. She was particularly focused on how the media landscape failed to reflect the rich diversity of the country, especially the voices of people of color. Her landmark case against a major media conglomerate for biased coverage of racial issues had earned her national attention. The lawsuit had not only highlighted the systemic biases in mainstream media, but had also led to a public conversation about the need for comprehensive media reform. But it was her more recent endeavor that truly placed her on a collision course with the powers that be. Amara had been working tirelessly to push for changes to federal media regulations, advocating for greater representation of marginalized communities and for the protection of independent voices online. Her initiative, known as the People's Media Project, had been gaining traction in legal circles and among social justice advocates, but it had not yet broken into the mainstream. Her plan was to influence policymakers to overhaul the Federal Communications Commission's FCC rules, ensuring that new regulations would protect media diversity and freedom of expression in the digital age. She had been relentless in her pursuit of this cause, meeting with legislators, speaking at rallies, and writing op-eds that were widely shared online. But despite her growing influence, Amara was often dismissed by those in power. The media establishment, which feared the loss of its grip on information, often painted her as a radical. Her legal opponents called her efforts a distraction, a boutique issue that would never gain real political momentum. What they didn't understand was that Amara wasn't just fighting for the present. She was building the future, and every step she took, every challenge she faced, brought her closer to a reckoning with a system that was about to learn that underestimating her would be its greatest mistake. The fine from Judge Collins was only the beginning. As soon as the courtroom doors closed behind her, Amara knew that the battle for justice was far from over. In fact, it felt like the moment that would ignite everything she had been working toward. She couldn't afford to let this injustice slide. She wasn't just fighting a local regulation. She was now fighting an oppressive system that sought to silence voices like hers. This fine, small in comparison to the larger scale of her advocacy, had sparked something much bigger. Within hours of her ruling, Amara took to social media to rally her supporters. Her post wasn't filled with bitterness or anger, though there was certainly plenty of that swirling inside her. Instead, it was a call to action. She shared the details of the fine and framed it as part of a larger fight for media freedom, using the hashtag #JusticeForVoices, which quickly began trending across multiple platforms. Her message was clear. This was not just about her. This was about all the people who had been marginalized, whose voices had been stifled by unjust policies and regulations. Her legal team, already well-versed in fighting systemic oppression, began organizing a strategy to challenge the fine. But Amara knew that this was more than just a legal battle. It was a cultural one. To change the law, she would need to change hearts and minds. She set her sights on a broader campaign to take her cause into the national spotlight, and she knew she had the right tools to do it. Her work with the People's Media Project had already begun to gain traction in legislative circles, but now the public was beginning to pay attention. News outlets that had previously ignored her work now began reaching out for interviews. Amara was becoming a voice for a new generation of activists who saw the internet and digital media as essential tools for social change. In interviews, she articulated her vision for a fairer, more inclusive media system, one that could break free from the grip of corporate interests and support independent voices, especially those of people of color. She spoke of the ways that media regulation had failed the public by limiting access to diverse viewpoints, particularly in the context of the internet, where much of today's discourse unfolded. As her story spread, Amara was invited to speak at conferences, join debates on TV programs, and participate in meetings with influential lawmakers. People who had once dismissed her as a radical were starting to listen, even if they didn't always agree. Amara's calm, composed demeanor in the face of adversity made her more persuasive, and soon there was a groundswell of support for her cause. Her message was resonating far beyond the confines of the legal community. It was becoming clear. Amara James was no longer just a lawyer fighting for justice. She was the leader of a movement that was gaining unstoppable momentum. And it was all starting to come together in the most unexpected way. because of a courtroom fine that had seemingly been meant to silence her. Judge Robert Collins sat at his desk, the faint echo of Amara James's words still ringing in his ears. Her passionate defense of free speech, her calm conviction in the face of his ruling, something about it gnawed at him. In the weeks following the courtroom incident, Collins had dismissed it as the rhetoric of a passionate activist, but as the media coverage surrounding Amara's case intensified, he found himself drawn back to the images of her calm defiance. The fine he had imposed was only one small piece of a much larger puzzle, one that he hadn't fully understood at the time. As stories about Amara flooded the news, the tone began to shift. No longer was she merely the target of a legal dispute. She was quickly becoming a symbol for a larger, more important cause. Collins couldn't deny it. Amara was not someone to be easily dismissed. He had seen the media reports, read the op-eds, and even heard her name mentioned in the halls of his own courthouse. Slowly, the narrative around her was gaining ground. Amara James, the woman he had fined, was now being portrayed as a trailblazer, someone who was taking on the very systems of power he had spent his life upholding. The dichotomy of his role as a judge and her emerging status as a public figure intrigued him. He had no doubt that his ruling was legal, but the larger questions it sparked about justice, free speech, and media regulation were far more complicated. Collins had always prided himself on being an impartial figure, one who based his decisions strictly on the law. Yet, as Amara's campaign gained traction, he began to feel a deep sense of discomfort with the ease in which he had enforced a law that many were now questioning. He had read her arguments about media monopolies and the impact of digital censorship on marginalized communities, and it was hard to ignore how her message was resonating, particularly with younger generations. Collins, who had spent most of his life within the confines of traditional legal circles, now found himself confronting a shift in how justice was being perceived, one that extended far beyond the courtroom. One evening, as he sat in his office reading yet another article about Amara's movement, he couldn't shake the realization that he might have been too quick to judge. He had been focused solely on the legal aspects of her case without considering the broader societal implications. Her work, he now recognized, was fundamentally changing the landscape of media law, and it was clear that her influence extended far beyond what he had originally understood. Out of curiosity, Collins decided to attend a conference on media regulation reform that was set to take place in a few weeks. The conference, which Amara was scheduled to speak at, promised to discuss many of the issues she had been championing for years. He knew that this would be his chance to listen, to hear her perspective firsthand, and perhaps reassess his earlier ruling with more context. Little did he know, this decision would set in motion a series of events that would change his life forever. The day of the media regulation conference arrived, and Judge Robert Collins found himself seated in the back of a large auditorium, feeling slightly out of place. The venue was packed with activists, media professionals, and policymakers, all there to discuss the future of media laws. The walls were lined with banners that read, "Fair representation for all," and "Free speech, no censorship." Collins couldn't remember the last time he had been in such an atmosphere, one filled with so much energy, passion, and urgency. Amara James was set to speak later in the day, and Collins was both intrigued and apprehensive. He had read her writings and seen her interviews, but he had never seen her in person, let alone listened to her speak before a crowd. The notion that someone like Amara, someone so different from his usual colleagues, could be leading a movement that was gaining real political momentum unsettled him. He had never considered himself an ally of her cause, but there was something undeniably compelling about her fight. When she finally took the stage, the room fell silent. Amara, dressed in a sharp, tailored suit that contrasted with her calm but commanding demeanor, approached the podium. She glanced around at the crowd, then began speaking with the precision and purpose of someone who had spent years carefully shaping their message. "Good afternoon," she began. "We live in a time where the media controls the narrative, and those who own the media hold immense power. But it doesn't have to be this way. There is a system at play that has been designed to limit voices like ours. a system that has told us time and again that our voices don't matter, that our stories don't belong. As she spoke, Collins couldn't help but be drawn in by her conviction. The room seemed to hang on her every word. Amara was no longer just a lawyer. She was a force of nature. She wasn't merely criticizing the current system. She was offering a solution. Her vision was one of inclusivity, fairness, and freedom. She talked about breaking down barriers for minority voices, fighting against the corporate giants that controlled public discourse, and ensuring that every citizen, regardless of background, had equal access to media and information. Amara's speech didn't just challenge the status quo. It dismantled it piece by piece, laying the foundation for a new system that was grounded in transparency, equity, and freedom. She spoke of creating media policies that didn't just regulate content, but actively encouraged diverse and independent voices to thrive. It was a vision that Collins had never truly considered before, one that seemed both idealistic and deeply necessary. As she concluded, the crowd erupted in applause, and Collins found himself clapping, though he hadn't intended to. The enthusiasm in the room was palpable, and for the first time, he realized that he had underestimated Amara. She wasn't just a radical out to disrupt the system. She was a visionary who had the power to reshape the media landscape. After the event, Collins lingered, hoping for a chance to speak with her. When he finally approached her, Amara smiled warmly, recognizing him immediately. There was no animosity in her expression, only the same calm resolve that had defined her throughout their earlier encounter. "Judge Collins," she said, extending her hand. "I wasn't expecting to see you here." "I wasn't sure I was either," he replied, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "But I've been listening to your message, and I think I have underestimated you." Amara James had worked tirelessly for years to reach this point, but now, as she stood in front of a federal panel of lawmakers and media experts, it felt like the culmination of everything she had fought for. The federal hearing on media regulation reform was the largest stage yet for her People's Media Project, a chance to influence national policy and advocate for the changes that would ensure a more inclusive, equitable media landscape. The hearing room was filled with tension and anticipation. Journalists, lobbyists, and lawmakers filled the seats, all eyes fixed on the speakers at the podium. Amara was prepared for the challenge. After all, she had faced much worse before. But this was different. This time, the stakes were higher. The proposed reforms could directly impact the way news was distributed across the country and would challenge the decades-long dominance of major media corporations. Amara stood at the podium, a calm yet commanding presence as she addressed the panel. Judge Robert Collins sat in the back, a quiet observer, still processing the events that had led him to this point. He had been invited to the hearing as part of his continued involvement with the media regulation issue, but his role today was merely as an observer. At least, that was his intention. Amara wasted no time, launching into her argument. "The media is no longer just an industry," she said, her voice steady and clear. "It is a battleground where the voices of marginalized communities are silenced, where independent perspectives are suppressed, and where the corporate giants continue to hold all the power." She paused, letting her words sink in. Collins couldn't help but watch her, impressed by how effortlessly she commanded the room. He had seen many speakers in his time, but none with the same combination of passion and precision that Amara demonstrated. He had underestimated her on every level. Amara continued, explaining the ways in which the current media regulations disproportionately affected people of color, independent journalists, and grassroots movements. She made a compelling case for why reform was not just necessary, but urgent. "We are no longer in an era where the corporate-owned media can dictate what stories are told and whose voices are heard," she argued. "The internet has leveled the playing field, but we have not updated our regulations to reflect that change. The time to act is now." Collins listened intently, his earlier reservations fading. He had expected to hear more of the fiery rhetoric he had initially dismissed. Instead, Amara's arguments were backed by data and concrete proposals that spoke directly to the shortcomings of the current media laws. She didn't just criticize the system. She was offering a blueprint for change. As the hearing wore on, Collins found himself reflecting on the initial fine he had imposed on Amara. He now realized how limited his understanding had been of her efforts. He had seen her only as a defiant figure, but today he saw a leader who was challenging an unjust system with the kind of courage that demanded respect. The hearing was a success for Amara. Her ideas were not only gaining traction, but were being discussed seriously by influential policymakers. Collins, too, was beginning to see the value of her approach. The gap between their worlds had never seemed wider, but in that moment, it was clear to him that they were both working toward the same goal: a more just, fair, and inclusive media landscape. After the hearing, Amara and Collins exchanged a few brief words, their earlier meeting now a distant memory. They both knew that their paths had crossed in a way that neither could have anticipated. As the room emptied, Collins walked out, his mind buzzing with new thoughts he had come to observe, but he left with a deeper understanding of the very movement that had once seemed foreign to him. Amara James had worked tirelessly for years to reach this point, but now, as she stood in front of a federal panel of lawmakers and media experts, it felt like the culmination of everything she had fought for. The federal hearing on media regulation reform was the largest stage yet for her People's Media Project, a chance to influence national policy and advocate for the changes that would ensure a more inclusive, equitable media landscape. The hearing room was filled with tension and anticipation. Journalists, lobbyists, and lawmakers filled the seats, all eyes fixed on the speakers at the podium. Amara was prepared for the challenge. After all, she had faced much worse before. But this was different. This time, the stakes were higher. The proposed reforms could directly impact the way news was distributed across the country and would challenge the decades-long dominance of major media corporations. Amara stood at the podium, a calm yet commanding presence as she addressed the panel. Judge Robert Collins sat in the back, a quiet observer, still processing the events that had led him to this point. He had been invited to the hearing as part of his continued involvement with the media regulation issue, but his role today was merely as an observer. At least, that was his intention. Amara wasted no time, launching into her argument. "The media is no longer just an industry," she said, her voice steady and clear. "It is a battleground where the voices of marginalized communities are silenced, where independent perspectives are suppressed, and where the corporate giants continue to hold all the power." She paused, letting her words sink in. Collins couldn't help but watch her, impressed by how effortlessly she commanded the room. He had seen many speakers in his time, but none with the same combination of passion and precision that Amara demonstrated. He had underestimated her on every level. Amara continued, explaining the ways in which the current media regulations disproportionately affected people of color, independent journalists, and grassroots movements. She made a compelling case for why reform was not just necessary, but urgent. "We are no longer in an era where the corporate-owned media can dictate what stories are told and whose voices are heard," she argued. "The internet has leveled the playing field, but we have not updated our regulations to reflect that change. The time to act is now." Collins listened intently, his earlier reservations fading. He had expected to hear more of the fiery rhetoric he had initially dismissed. Instead, Amara's arguments were backed by data and concrete proposals that spoke directly to the shortcomings of the current media laws. She didn't just criticize the system. She was offering a blueprint for change. As the hearing wore on, Collins found himself reflecting on the initial fine he had imposed on Amara. He now realized how limited his understanding had been of her efforts. He had seen her only as a defiant figure, but today he saw a leader who was challenging an unjust system with the kind of courage that demanded respect. The hearing was a success for Amara. Her ideas were not only gaining traction, but were being discussed seriously by influential policymakers. Collins, too, was beginning to see the value of her approach. The gap between their worlds had never seemed wider, but in that moment, it was clear to him that they were both working toward the same goal: a more just, fair, and inclusive media landscape. After the hearing, Amara and Collins exchanged a few brief words, their earlier meeting now a distant memory. They both knew that their paths had crossed in a way that neither could have anticipated. As the room emptied, Collins walked out, his mind buzzing with new thoughts. He had come to observe, but he left with a deeper understanding of the very movement that had once seemed foreign to him. Judge Robert Collins sat at his desk, staring at the draft of his letter to Amara James. He had written it countless times in his mind, but now, as the words finally took form on the page, he was struck by how simple yet significant this gesture was. He had always prided himself on his impartiality as a judge, but now, that very impartiality felt like a shield he had been hiding behind. The time had come to take responsibility for the way he had underestimated Amara, both as an activist and as a force for change. The letter he composed was straightforward. He began by acknowledging the fine he had imposed, recognizing the broader implications of that decision in light of her advocacy for media reform. He admitted that, at the time, he had been too focused on the technicalities of the law to see the bigger picture, the picture that she had been trying to paint for years. He expressed his respect for her dedication to justice and her ability to lead a movement that was now transforming the nation's media landscape. Finally, he ended the letter with a simple, heartfelt apology for his role in silencing her voice. When the letter was sent, Collins didn't expect an immediate response, nor did he expect forgiveness. But it didn't matter. The important part was that he had acted with integrity, acknowledging the flaws in his judgment. It was his first step in aligning himself with the cause that had begun with Amara's fight, and it felt like the right thing to do. Meanwhile, Amara was riding the momentum of her successes. Her People's Media Project had been gaining bipartisan support in Congress, and her proposed reforms to the media landscape were gaining ground. But the road ahead was far from smooth. The corporate interests she had fought so hard against weren't giving up easily. They had deep pockets and long-established power structures that they were willing to defend at all costs. Still, Amara pressed forward, knowing that the future of free speech depended on her success. Then, one afternoon, a letter arrived from Judge Collins. She opened it with curiosity, not sure what to expect. As she read his apology, her initial reaction was one of surprise. She had expected the legal system to continue brushing her off, not to hear from one of its own judges acknowledging his misstep. His words were thoughtful and sincere, and she could feel the weight of his honesty. It wasn't just an apology, it was an invitation. Collins had asked if she would consider sitting down with him to discuss the ongoing reforms. He was no longer the judge who would find her. He was someone who now understood the importance of her cause and wanted to help however he could. Amara didn't hesitate. She responded positively, eager to turn this moment into something more than just a personal reconciliation. It was the beginning of an unexpected but powerful alliance. Collins, once a figure of authority who had been a part of the system she fought against, was now joining forces with her to continue challenging the status quo. Their meeting was not only a symbol of redemption for Collins, but a recognition that even the most entrenched systems could evolve. Together, they would push for a future where the media was not a tool for the powerful, but a platform for everyone. Amara's movement had already begun to reshape the national conversation, and now, with Judge Collins on her side, it was about to get a whole lot stronger. And so, the fight for media justice continued, this time with a united front.